Let's talk about some slightly unorthodox tactics in Warhammer 40k and the leaders that just don't really feel like stopping with units. Sometimes you might just not want to suffer the boredom of leading a squad around if you're pretty capable of going it alone. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought I'd do a quick video on perhaps some slightly unorthodox tactics in Warhammer 40k, and why for some lists in some cases it might make sense to send the leaders off their own and just forget about any squad buffs that they might have. One of the major changes to 10th edition Warhammer 40k is that Games Workshop brought back character attachments to units that happened to be in previous editions of the game, but in 8th and 9th edition they've broadly been run solo. There are certainly characters that still go it alone, usually using the lone operative keyword that I'm not really focusing on here too much. Obviously I'd expect them to be ranging around the battlefield, protected by their immunity from shooting at greater than 12 inches, but in general for the vast majority of characters in the game it doesn't make sense to employ the same sort of tactics for any other character units on the board, as in general they'll be treated as just about any other unit and could easily be gunned down on their own. In general, there's two main reasons that you usually want to attach leader characters to squads when you're building an army list in Warhammer 40k. First of all, the most obvious one is that they generally give you buffs and extra improvements to the unit if you fill them inside them. Say for example a Space Marine captain giving his unit free stratagems, or things like a lieutenant giving you lethal hits for the unit. Most characters tend to have at least something like that, though I feel like the buffing rules aren't really all made equal, and some are of greater or lesser importance. The other big advantage to running characters attached to units is durability. Typically characters are deliberately priced to have very bad durability for the cost. Even if you had something fairly chunky like a Gravis captain with a medium toughness and a good amount of wounds, when you're paying around about 80 points for that, it's not really all that standout, as that'll be the same sort of price tag as you'd be paying for an entire squad worth of troops, or perhaps another light vehicle which would probably have high toughness characteristics. In general, that just usually means it's a very bad idea to run leader units all out on their own, as even if you could hide them from enemy line of sight behind ruins and things, you might still just get plinked via ignores line of sight shooting, say if the opponent took some whirlwinds or basilisks along. Despite this though, the logic doesn't always hold true, and there are really quite a lot of competitive lists out there that have leaders in them that have no intention to attach to any units, and overall the trade-offs of generally being a little bit fragile and easy to kill can actually be well worth it for not having to take the tax of a squad along. Generally the characters will need to have some good value, either just in their own damage and defense or other fun special rules to buff units, and usually a way to hide somehow. Maybe hiding in transports, going in strategic reserve, or other fun ways to protect them, or even just surprisingly good toughness for their cost. In this video I thought we'd take a look through a chunk of those that I've seen in competitive tournament lists, leaders that certainly could have had a bodyguard unit to attach them to, but the controlling player has chosen not to. First up, and one of the things that inspired me to make this video, were Lord Invocatus and the Juggernaut Lord of the World Eaters, both of which are chosen to run solo at least fairly often in competitive lists, and a big thank you to a certain Mr. Trout, who took me through the thinking behind this a little. Both of these guys are kind of happy to not attach to units for different reasons. The Juggernaut Lord is 100 points and generally has fairly good toughness for the cost, and in World Eater's list, typically you want one unit that's on the board and not in a transport to be able to activate the Favourite of Khorne enhancement to allow you to get full rerolls on the Blessings of Khorne dice. It can be kind of critical whether or not you have the best chance to resurrect Angron, or get to fish for the big advance and charge, which is the highest chance of failing otherwise. The only other options for that would be a Master of Executions, which would typically want to go in a transport, or a Demon Prince of Khorne, which is pretty pricey and you want to be throwing it up the board, and in general you probably wouldn't want to task Khorne Berserkers with a Master of Executions to just sit on a home field objective all game long. It just feels like you're overcommitting a whole bunch of threat to sitting around on a point. As a result, babysitting the Favourite of Khorne seems to fall to a lone lord on a Juggernaut, tough enough to not just be instantly killed by a bit of indirect firepower if the opponent does have some going, and he is enough of a melee threat in his own right to be able to deal with backfield interlopers if the opponent does decide to send some deep strikers or something after the home field of the World Eaters, which often is kind of sparsely covered as everything else has gone charging up to smash the enemy. It's perhaps not too dissimilar for Lord Invocatus at 140 points. His primary role is to buff 2 scouting units, throwing things like Khorne Berserkers or Exalted 8 bound up the board right from turn 1. The scout move plus some big Blessings of Khorne movement buffs can easily have you threatening first turn charges. After that role is done though, he just maybe isn't really needed in extra 8 bound units. You could add more melee threat to the units, but they usually tend to be fairly capable of tearing apart whatever they can get their chain fists on. And the only actual buff that he gives to the unit is to fall back and charge, which is a nice to have but far from essential. Occasionally his presence could be kind of problematic as well, seeing as he's cavalry and would have to go around ruin walls and things, whereas the infantry can ghost straight through. And there is a little bit of rules as written weirdness with if he attaches to an exalted 8-bound unit, technically he can't select that unit to be able to scout, given that it's not all infantry. So that definitely seems like an oversight on Games Workshop's part, as opposed to something deliberate. In any case though, it perhaps doesn't matter too much, given that he is tanky enough to be very much non-trivial to take down, 8 wounds with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable save. Really quite fast, so he can move up the board and hide behind ruins as he goes. And arguably a lot of his value is already done by the time he's already activated those scout moves to give yourself some horrendous turn 1 charges if you want them. Between all this, it looks like he's tanky and dangerous enough just to be run as his own threat from then on. Another interesting one that I've seen being used in some top Eldari lists is Fuegan being run alone. On paper, something like this should really feel like a dumb idea, given that he's 115 points and only toughness 3, even though he does have a 2+ save, a 4+ invulnerable, and a 5+ feel no pain. In general, that would still make him really quite squishy for the points. Things like melter plasma or anti-tank weapons would be pretty terrifying to him. It seems that he is good enough to make this work though, and arguably you're not really buying him much extra durability for the points by throwing in fire dragons, as they're pretty costly for their defensive profile as well. He definitely has enough damage to justify himself being run alone, I think. His Searsong Fire Pike is strength 14, AP 4 and damage D6, but it's an enormous melter 6 if he can get within 9 inches of an enemy unit, which is just absolutely brutal and pretty amazing with the battle host rerolls that he gets, as he's usually going to be converting both the hit and the wound. Even if he's just hiding behind ruins in the deployment zone or in the midfield somewhere and threatening objectives, if the opponent pushes up with any heavy hitters, he could take an enormous chunk out of them. If he's within range of an objective marker as well, he can be pretty terrifying just with his Overwatch as well. If you pay for Overwatch and then plug in an automatic 6 from a Strands of Fate dice, that could be one hit with that enormous profile with the damage D6 plus 6. Or he could use his multi-shot profile with his beam. An automatic 6 has sustained hits D3, so that's an average of 3 hits at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 2. Again, could really ruin an elite infantry squad's day. His melee is also fairly nasty, with 6 attacks at strength 5, AP 4 and damage 3, pretty ruinous to space marines there, and in particular with battle host rerolls. And maybe one of the things that gives you the insurance to run him just on his own is the fact that when he dies he gets back up when he's slain on a 2+ when he's killed for the first time. It means that even if he was completely right out in the open and the enemy was only able to shoot him or only able to charge him, then he'd pretty much guarantee that he just stands straight back up to have another go and do a whole load more damage the next turn with full health remaining. With his 4+ invulnerable as well, I'd say is always not going to be guaranteed to take down. You can always roll quite well with that, or could even use some 4+ Strands of Fate dice to allow him to succeed some things automatically. In general, between all that, he's just in a really good spot to cause problems. He could also be kind of interesting in jumping out of a Wave Serpent or something like that. That could be one way of keeping him safe against indirect fire. For one of the single priciest leader characters out there, we've got Abaddon the Despoiler, an enormous price tag at 310 points, and while he does bring some really cool things to the army, he's also costing you a big chunk of your force, and even more so if you're buying him a bodyguard like some Terminators or something. As a result, I certainly have seen a couple of competitive Chaos lists deciding to run him completely solo, as his buffs aren't really tied to actually leading a unit. Perhaps his biggest and most impactful buff is an aura of reroll hits that can be absolutely brutal with Chaos Space Marine firepower like Forge Fiends or Obliterators. It's quite a good damage boost just in itself, but in Chaos Space Marines it's far more important, as you could say have Nurgle for sustained hits going off on a 5+ when they're shooting, or even sustained and lethal hits if you decide to stack the Chaos Castle really high by adding in a Hellbrute. He could also use the 4+ invulnerable save aura he's got for supporting accursed cultists as well. That makes them spectacularly hard to take down. On top of that, he farms 1 command point per battle round. He just needs to make sure he can take a Dark Pact each turn to do so that's a lot of extra value right there. I wouldn't say that his durability is particularly good for 310 points, though again he's not easy to kill if he's playing cagey. 9 wounds at toughness 5 with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable is definitely going to need at least some focused fire. Perhaps his ace in the hole that really allows him to be viable this way though is that he has access to that Nurgle stratagem to prevent him getting shot outside of 12 inches. It means that if it's absolutely critical and he's going to be tanking some unacceptably risky shooting, you could just pull that out. Though I guess that does restrict your options from using it elsewhere in the force this turn. With all this though, he could give you a couple of rounds of some seriously powerful shooting with Forge Fiends or Obliterators, a few free CP, and then hopefully in the mid-game commit to combat himself as well. He is pretty massive on the countercharge, 8 attacks at strength 14, AP 4 and damage 3 is just enormous in his own right, never mind if you take into account dark packs and reroll hits. Maybe moving into a few things that are perhaps a little bit more niche. I've seen at least one successful Tau competitive list run a lone Ethereal around. 50 points for a cheap character. Typically the idea would be to attach them to a Fire Warrior squad to make them a little bit tankier while generating you command points, but it's a bit strange in that it could be used as an interesting sort of actions and objectives type secondary character while rustling you up CP. Ethereals are spectacularly easy to kill, so most of the time you wouldn't want them on the board, unless the opponent maybe has literally no indirect fire or anything like that, then maybe you could just hide them in a ruined corner or something. But the interesting thing about Ethereals is that the CP generation seems to work when they're off the board. I believe from the designer's commentary, unit abilities do work when they're in reserves, but they just don't work when they're in transports, weirdly. It means that in theory, if you took a 50-point Ethereal and reserved him for the first couple of battle rounds, you'd have 3 dice overall that you'd be rolling on a 4+ to generate a command point each turn, and presumably he turns up onto the battlefield on battle round 3. Ideally as a nice expendable unit to maybe just throw and do a secondary objective, like hopefully being able to do something like behind enemy lines in the enemy backfield, or investigating signals in the corner of the board or something. Then he'll almost certainly die if the opponent can see him with anything at all, as he is only toughness 3 and not too hard to take down. You might be able to hide him behind a ruin or something to try and get one more turn of life and CP generation. Still though, if he's competing against something like a Vespid squad to do a similar sort of drop and do things sort of role, it could be interesting enough. Trade out a bit of damage dealing threat and some durability for some generated CP early in the game. Next up, one tactic that I think is probably a bit more of a fun and cool tactic as opposed to anything being super competitive, but I couldn't really resist talking about it after I was messaged it as a tactics idea from the channel email address. It's the idea of putting a couple of Primaris Psychers into a Chimera and having it as basically a mind gun platform to blast the enemy with smites, and to be fair to it, create some pretty spectacular anti-space marine kind of firepower. The idea is that you have a Chimera that's otherwise empty bar a couple of Primaris Psychers. The Psychers themselves are 120 points for the pair of them, the Chimera is 70, and it has firing deck too, so both of them can do smite things out the top hatch. Chimeras I think are really cheap and efficient for the cost, a good defensive profile, a bunch of las guns, a heavy stubber, and maybe a couple of heavy flamers or some longer range weapons for the cost. It's genuinely not too bad at dealing with lighter infantry in its own right, and then you can add the smite attacks from the top hatch. Between the two Psychers, they'll be hitting you with 2d6 plus 6, strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2 shots, all with devastating wounds, and they have 2 sets of the blast keyword between that. So if you happen to be targeting anything with 10 or more models in it, the attacks and hits are really going to stack up very quickly. If you were taking aim at something like a 20 block of Necron Warriors, for example, that would be all the way up to an average of 21 shots. The hazardous profile that usually has the chance to kill the Primaris Psychers if they're in a squad, that would instead be tanked on the Chimera, which is rather nice. And then you could certainly get extra buffs for the unit that they're trying to kill. You could maybe get a tank order for a +1 to hit for this Death Chimera, Sentinel rerolls of 1 to hit, or maybe Fields of Fire. Just on the base profile without any other investment though, it already kills around about 5 Space Marines just between the Psychers alone, never mind anything that the Chimera chips in, or kills around about 2 Space Marine Terminators per turn. Again, that's with no further buffs. It's not anywhere near as threatening against big heavier vehicles, though the devastating wounds does help out a bit, but overall it's just kind of surprising at just how genuinely efficient this is. The big disadvantage being that they're just fairly easy to kill for the points cost. Chimeras aren't anywhere near as tough as Rosses that you might get for the same 190 points investment. I guess you'd probably want to run it alongside other things that are maybe making a bit more of a spectacle of themselves and tanking damage, and if possible I think you'd want to try and park the Chimera up next to some line of sight blocking terrain. Then when the Chimera is inevitably blown up, you could get the Psychers out behind the terrain and keep them safe to move forward in your turn for one last strike and a bunch more damage before they die. Overall I thought this was kind of fun anyway, and feels like the sort of unit that your opponent might underestimate until you've let it have a round or two of shooting against them. Finally, just for another couple of units that I have seen run before individually, Typhus I made a mention of in the last list video with Death Guard. I have seen a fair few lists where it looks like he's going to be the one run individually without either Pox Walkers or Death Shroud Terminators, though I feel like both of those are very reasonable choices for him as well. Overall he's just a character with deep strike, really quite tanky with toughness 6, a 4+ invulnerable and a 2+ save, pretty punchy melee all at damage 3, and a fairly brutal mortal wound psychic attack, with D3 plus 3 mortal wounds that isn't even technically shooting. Can be an interesting unit for trying to do things where you drop behind the enemy lines to do secondaries and things, and then have a unit that's both sufficiently threatening and kind of hard to kill, so it might cause your opponent some real problems unless they can line up some heavy firepower on him. Finally, Farsight had perhaps put in somewhat the same boat here, 90 points as a fairly fast battlesuit character, and while he is more commonly run in crisis squads, accenting the big +1 to wound if they get close, I have at least seen a couple of successful competitive lists that have chosen to run him just completely individually. He's perhaps not enormously ridiculously less tanky than individual crisis suits, could be an interesting choice for rapid ingress, gets a couple of punchy damage 3 shots with his plasma rifle, and then goes charging into combat with some really big rerolls once per game, plus the pretty effective use of tank shock as well given that he has the vehicle keyword and strength 10. Definitely not inconceivable with one rapid ingress charge that he could do enough damage to justify 90 points then and there, though after that he is fairly fragile for how much he costs. Maybe not the most normal use of him, but for 90 points for some actually seriously threatening dedicated melee in a Tau army, I can see him being interesting that way. So anyway, let me know what you think of these slightly weird use cases for leader characters. Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below, as per always, and in particular any other characters that you've chosen to run solo that otherwise could have led some squads. 40k's got a lot of character options, I'm sure I missed plenty of options that could be usable that way. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.